As we hear in this CFI report, the United Nations Security Council has given ECOWAS 45 days to come up with a concrete decision.
Officials from ECOWAS and the African Union were meeting in Bamako on Friday to put together a plan to take back the north of Mali from Islamic radicals. Already certain is that some 3,000 armed ECOWAS soldiers are to be sent to Mali, but from which countries exactly and the exact mandate of the force have yet to be determined. The United Nations Security Council gave ECOWAS 45 days to put forward precise plans on October 12th.
African Union wants to work with Mali, with the UN, with ECOWAS, so that we can all come to some consensus about the way forward. We would like Mali to accompany Mali as it tries to regain its territorial integrity.
The armed intervention is supposed to have the backing of the international community, though a number of countries do not agree with all the details.
We believe that negotiations between Mali and the armed groups should be our priority.
Taking back the north of Mali from the Islamic radicals who have links to Al-Qaeda and who are continuing to demolish Islamic heritage sites will not happen overnight. The current Malian president, Diankunda Traoré, has called for urgent action, saying there is not a second more to lose.
A court in Rwanda has for the third time postponed the verdict of a prominent opposition figure accused of complicity to commit acts of terror and spreading the idea of genocide. And the leaders of Liberia and the Ivory Coast, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Alassane Ouattara respectively, have been exploring ways of military cooperation as the two countries strive to put an end to attacks launched against Ivory Coast from Liberia by fighters loyal to former Ivorian leader Laurent Gbagbo. We have details of those and other stories in this African News Roundup.
The Rwandan court has postponed the verdict of opposition leader Victoire Ingabire for a third time. Ms. Ingabire is charged with complicity to commit acts of terrorism and spreading the ideology of genocide. The reason given is that the investigating judges need more time. On Thursday, the court rejected an appeal by the defense, which challenges the constitutionality of the Rwandan law on genocide. That law is being invoked in charges against Ms. Ingabire. The verdict is expected on October 30th. If found guilty, Ms. Ingabire faces life in prison. Côte d'Ivoire's President Alassane Ouattara met with Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Abidjan on Thursday. The reason for the three-hour meeting was security. The two countries are to begin joint military maneuvers before the end of the year. The goal of the operation is to end the attacks in Côte d'Ivoire launched from across the border in western Liberia. The authors of the attacks are believed to be supporters of former President Laurent Gbagbo. Libyan authorities are trying to negotiate a peaceful entry into Bani Walid, once a stronghold of Gaddafi's supporters. Residents of the city are accused of protecting members of the toppled regime. On Wednesday, militias on government orders attacked the city. Municipal authorities prevented their entry. They fear that the militias will carry out reprisals for the death of a former rebel from Misrata who was kidnapped and tortured in Bani Walid.
Relations between Washington and Moscow are set to take center stage when the U.S. presidential candidates hold their final debate on Monday. Barack Obama came to office in 2008 promising to resettle ties with Russia. But as CNN's Phil Black reports, that has not quite worked out, and at some time, Kremlin say we could face a new Cold War if Mitt Romney takes over the Oval Office.
Manita, the Obama administration's reset policy with Russia has delivered some achievements, but there have also been many disappointments, and it hasn't fixed the one underlying problems in relations. There is little to no trust between these two countries. There were some early predictions that because this is an election year in both countries, it was never going to be a great period of time for good relations, that fiery, inflammatory language used by politicians playing to domestic audiences would drown out any real attempt or chance of working constructively together. And that is exactly what has happened, both here in Russia and in the United States as well. Russia became an election issue when President Barack Obama was overheard saying this to its outgoing president.
This is my last election, yeah. And after my election, I have more flexibility.
That promise of flexibility triggered this from his opponent.
This is to Russia. This is, without question, our #1 geopolitical foe.
A view that didn't go over well in Russia.
I think that, yes, Mr. Romney may be a disaster.
Alexei Pushkov chairs the Russian Parliament's International Affairs Committee. A senior member of the governing United Russia Party, he is well connected with the Kremlin.
Mr. Romney is not definitely someone who strikes me as a person of the 21st century in the foreign policy.
Pushkov believes Romney is wrong in saying Obama is soft on Russia because this has been a very difficult, sometimes confrontational year for the two countries. It started last December. Russians took to the streets after disputed parliamentary elections. US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also criticized the vote, and Vladimir Putin, then Russian Prime Minister, accused her of encouraging the protests.
Mr. Putin interpreted certain remarks made by Secretary of State Clinton as something which shows that the Americans are inclined towards regime change in Russia too.
Syria has proved the most emotional issue. US officials have said Russia has blood on its hands for vetoing tough resolutions in the UN Security Council and for selling weapons to the Syrian regime. Russia doesn't trust America's intentions.
We hear that the United States are after human rights, democracy, freedom, and so on. And then we see that in a majority of cases, it has to do with geopolitical interests.
In September, the Kremlin ordered the closure of the US Agency for International Development after 20 years' work and billions of dollars on health, democracy and human rights programs. Moscow said the agency was trying to interfere in domestic politics. And only a few weeks later, Russia declared it won't renew an agreement with the United States, which has helped secure and destroy thousands of Cold War-era nuclear weapons in former Soviet countries. All of this comes after the Obama administration's much-hyped policy of pushing the reset button with Russia. So despite a major effort by Barack Obama to improve relations with Russia, there is very little trust or friendship. In Moscow, the fear is things could get even worse if Mitt Romney wins and lives up to the language he's been using during the campaign.
We'll be talking about a new Cold War if Romney is serious about what he's saying.
But there are also people who believe Barack Obama should have been much tougher with Russia. Commentator Konstantin von Eggert is one of them, but he admits very few Russians agree with him.
In this particular time of the so-called reset, he was perceived as someone who is negotiating with Russia from the position of weakness. And that meant that Russian decision makers and Putin himself thought they can push the buck even further.
There is a list of sensitive issues the next US president will have to address with Russia. His challenge will be preventing an already frosty relationship turning very cold.
And before we end this edition of the news, a reminder of our headlines. The President, His Excellency Sheikh Professor Al-Hagi Dr. Yahya Jammeh, has reached out to 127 Gambian pilgrims in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with a cash donation of over $70,000. The Supreme Court of the Gambia Friday dismissed the appeal filed by Langtombong Tamba and 6 others facing the death sentence. Officials of the Sub-Regional Economic Bloc ECOWAS and the African Union have been meeting to iron out modalities on liberating northern Mali from the clutches of armed Islamist groups. And confronting the enemy within, the leaders of Liberia and the Ivory Coast are stepping up military cooperation aimed at ending reprisal attacks by Liberia-based Gbagbo loyalists on the Ouattara government. That brings us to the end of this edition of the news. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of our programs.